Mud does not care who you are. It swallows boots from Manchester and boots from Munich with the same patient hunger. It fills the same trenches, buries the same rats, and clings to the same frozen wool coats regardless of the flag stitched onto the shoulder. By December of 1914, the men crouched along an 800-mile scar cut through Belgium, and France had learned this lesson the hard way. The war that was supposed to be over by autumn had settled into something else entirely. A wet, freezing, endless waiting. Private Thomas Whitfield was 20 years old, and he had already stopped believing the war would make sense. He had joined in August, when the recruiting posters still promised glory, and the girls in his village still waved handkerchiefs at departing trains. 5 months later, glory had a smell. It smelled like wet earth, cordite, and something underneath both of those that no one talked about after dark. His trench sat 40 yards from the German line near the small Belgian village of Saint-Yvon. Close enough that on quiet nights, if the wind was right, he could hear them talking, laughing sometimes. It unsettled him more than the shelling did. Shells you could hate, laughter was harder to hate. That December had brought the coldest nights anyone could remember. Frost turned the mud to iron by midnight and softened it to soup by noon. Whitfield's feet had gone numb somewhere around the second week and never fully returned. He kept a photograph of his mother folded inside his cap, the paper gone soft as cloth from handling. On the other side of the wire, a German Gefreiter named Anton Bruckner was doing the same thing, though Whitfield didn't know his name yet. Bruckner was 22, a printer's apprentice from a small town outside Cologne, and he had a photograph too, his younger sister, laughing at something outside the frame, taken the summer before the war swallowed everything. Neither man knew the other existed as anything more than a silhouette against the wire at dawn. That was how the war wanted it. A silhouette was easy to kill. A person was not. On the 23rd of December, word moved down the British line the way rumours always did, faster than any official order. Word that the Germans across from the Royal Warwickshires, a mile up the line, had lit candles on small trees along their parapet, that someone had shouted Merry Christmas in accented English, and no one had shot him for it. Whitfield didn't believe it until he heard it himself. 2 nights later, Christmas Eve came in hard and clear, the kind of cold that makes the stars look sharpened. The shelling had stopped around dusk, not ordered, just stopped, the way exhausted men sometimes agree without speaking. Whitfield sat in the firing bay with his rifle across his knees, breath fogging in front of him, listening to nothing. Nothing was worse than the guns in its way. Nothing meant his mind had room to wander, and his mind kept wandering toward home. Then he heard it. A voice, low, unaccompanied, carrying across the frozen dead ground between the lines. German words, but the melody needed no translation. His mother had sung him the English version 1,000 times, standing over his bed with a candle guttering on the sill. Still a nacht, silent night. Whitfield stood without deciding to. He edged up the trench ladder and looked over the sandbags. Rifle still slung, and there, impossibly, madly, a small fir tree stood on the German parapet, decorated with what looked like scraps of tin and a handful of real candles, flames bending sideways in the wind but refusing to die. A German soldier stood beside it, alone, singing into the dark toward an enemy he couldn't see, the way a man sings when he's forgotten anyone is listening at all. Down the line, an English voice, uncracked, hesitant, picked up the tune in its own language. Then another. Within a minute, both trenches were singing the same carol in 2 languages, neither side quite believing what it was doing, both sides unable to stop. When the song ended, silence came back. But it was a different silence than before, softer. "Merry Christmas, Tommy," a voice called from the German side. A long pause. Then from somewhere near Whitfield, "Merry Christmas, Fritz." "You'd better not shoot at us tonight." "We won't shoot if you don't." Laughter. Actual laughter, rolling across the ground where men had been trying to kill each other 12 hours earlier. Whitfield didn't sleep that night. None of them did. They talked across the wire in the dark, trading insults about the food, trading jokes about their officers. Two enemy armies discovering they'd been fighting people who complained about the same cold, missed the same families, hated the same mud. Morning came grey and merciless, the way Flanders mornings always did. And that was when it happened, the moment no general planned, no order authorized, and no history book fully explained. A man climbed out of the German trench. He carried nothing. No rifle, no pistol. Both hands raised, palms open, in the universal grammar of a man who means no harm. He stood in no man's land, the strip of churned earth where nothing was supposed to survive, let alone stand upright, and waited. Whitfield's sergeant hissed at the men to hold fire. Up and down the British line, 300 rifles stayed lowered. 300 fingers stayed off the trigger, for reasons none of them could have explained to a court-martial. Then, slowly an Englishman climbed out too, more followed. On both sides. Men who an hour earlier had been enemies in the truest, most absolute sense the word could carry, now walking toward each other across ground, littered with unexploded shells and the frozen dead from November's fighting. Hands empty, breath visible, hearts hammering. Whitfield went over the top because his legs decided before his mind did. He crossed the wire. He crossed the shell craters, and there, standing in the mud that had claimed so many boys from both nations, he found himself face to face with the soldier who had been singing the night before. Anton Bruckner was younger than he looked from a distance. His uniform was patched at the elbow. His hands, when he extended one, were shaking slightly, from cold or fear or both. Whitfield shook it. Neither man spoke the other's language well, but war has its own vocabulary, and grief translates without a dictionary. Bruckner reached into his coat and produced a photograph, the laughing girl, his sister, and Whitfield understood without a single word being exchanged. He reached for his own cap and showed the soft, folded photograph of his mother. Two boys who had been trained to see each other as targets stood in a frozen field and showed each other their mothers, their sisters, their homes. Somewhere along the line, someone produced a football. Nobody could later agree on whose idea it was. That detail, like so much of that day, would blur in the retelling for the rest of both men's lives. Helmets became goalposts. Men who had buried friends the week before were suddenly running, laughing, shouting encouragement in two languages that didn't need translating, because joy sounds the same everywhere. Bruckner traded a handful of cigars for the chocolate in Whitfield's ration tin. Down the line, men exchanged buttons, badges, addresses scrawled on scraps of paper, with promises to write after the war. Promises that, for some of them, would never be kept. Because the war was not finished with either army. There was another task that Christmas morning, too, quieter and heavier than the football. Burial parties from both sides worked together in the grey light, retrieving the dead who had lain in no man's land since the fighting in November, men frozen into the earth that neither army had been able to safely reach. British and German soldiers dug side by side, lowered enemy dead into the same ground with the same care, and for a few minutes a young British chaplain read the burial service aloud, while soldiers of both uniforms stood with their heads bowed, united by the one thing war could not divide, the plain fact of death, and the plain need to give it some dignity. Bruckner helped carry a British corporal's body himself. He did not know the man's name. It did not matter. His hands were careful anyway. By afternoon, snow began to fall, softening the wire, the craters. The churned mud meant for a few hours almost beautiful. Whitfield would remember that day for the rest of his life as the one place the war had briefly gotten it wrong. Not defeated, not won, simply and for a handful of hours, forgotten by the very men it was designed to consume. But war does not forgive absence for long. By evening, officers on both sides, under pressure from commanders far behind the lines who had heard rumors of fraternization and did not like what they heard, began quietly ordering the men back to their positions. The truce had no official sanction. It existed only because thousands of exhausted young men, independently and without permission, had decided for one day that the enemy in front of them was not worth killing. Whitfield shook Bruckner's hand one final time. Bruckner said something in German that Whitfield didn't fully understand, but the tone needed no translation, something between gratitude and apology. The words of a man who already suspected what came next. They returned to their trenches on opposite sides of the wire. The following days brought silence longer than anyone expected. A strange, fragile quiet neither side wanted to break. But somewhere down the line, an artillery officer who had not been present for the truce, who knew nothing of footballs or photographs or shared cigars, gave the order that reminded both armies what they were there to do. The guns woke on the 26th. Whitfield never learned what became of Anton Bruckner. Military records from both sides, fragmentary and scattered by 4 more years of war, offer no certainty. It's possible he survived the war entirely. It's possible he did not survive that winter. What the historical record does confirm is that thousands of men who took part in truces like this one, up and down the Western Front, in places whose names have mostly been forgotten, returned within days to trying once again to kill the same men whose photographs they had held that morning. High command on both sides moved quickly to make sure nothing like it happened again. Orders were issued. Artillery bombardments were scheduled deliberately for future Christmases, specifically to prevent men from climbing out of their trenches a second time. The war machine, it turned out, could tolerate almost anything except the discovery that the men fighting it did not actually hate each other. Thomas Whitfield fought for 3 more years. He carried 2 things through all of it: the photograph of his mother and the memory of a stranger's hand, cold and shaking, gripping his own in a frozen field that belonged, for one single day, to no army at all. History remembers the Christmas Truce of 1914 as a footnote, a strange, brief anomaly in 4 years of industrial slaughter. The men who lived it never treated it that way. For them, it was proof of something the war spent 4 more years trying to make them forget, that the man across the wire was never really the enemy. He was simply another boy, cold and frightened and far from home, following the same orders, missing the same mother, praying to survive the same mud. They returned to opposite sides of the war. But neither man ever forgot the day they looked into the eyes of the enemy and saw themselves.